So welcome everyone to our UK Cybersecurity and Privacy Seminar Series. It's the turn of Oxford this week to host our seminar, and I'm very grateful for Ian in Thornton-Trump for coming along and giving a talk for us. Yes, just to say, please do feel free to add any questions or anything in the chat there. We'll look to answer those towards the end. If there's something that needs clarification or something like that, I can always jump in. But otherwise, I think possibly we'll leave those to the end. But yes, other than that, I think I'm happy to pass over to you, Ian. I might go and make sure that the YouTube stream is up and running. Okay.
The stream is not up at the moment.
I'm going to go and have a look at that. I'll have a look at it now. Brilliant. So I think, Ian, if you're happy to begin, I think
you can go in technical support.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for having me, and a huge thank you to Oxford University. It's really my pleasure to be here today with you. Just to give you a little bit of a background, I'm originally Canadian. I came over in 2015. I joined a startup called Logic Now, which was then acquired by SolarWinds. And I've done some things after that that we'll get into. My current role is CISO for Cyjax Limited, which is a threat intelligence company. I want to really sort of set the scenario for you, because understanding the history of cybersecurity and where we have arrived to now is a really central point, because I think one of the things that we're globally struggling with is the amount of legacy IT and legacy tooling that we've had in place. And there's two trends. Obviously, the first trend is pretty obvious with the now $6 trillion US dollar global losses to cybercrime in 2021. And obviously it's growing, it's massive. We're seeing everything ranging from, ransomware attacks that have been in the news to large-scale espionage operations conducted, with cyber operations, and a hybrid blend of traditional physical criminality with cybercrime. But increasingly, my observations in this place really comes down to two issues. The first is that when a company suffers a data breach, it's not really about the loss of money or the impact of that data breach from an expense bottom line. It's truly a loss of trust in that brand. And it takes a lot of work to win back trust. And I think that is one of the things that has dispelled the myth of the cost per record of data breach. Because it was a flawed metric to begin with. In 2015, I co-wrote a paper with Davey Winder around the cost of data breach, and that the fact of measuring cost per record was kind of a useless metric. And the other problem that I've discerned is it's not really about the money, and it's not about the people, technology, and process. It is truly about the leadership in this space. So this volcano, Mount Doom from Lord of the Rings erupting away represents this scenario of data breach to me in several different ways. I would say that volcano, obviously the lava is very dangerous. It goes anywhere it wants. It's unimpeded. It's a good metaphor for the sensitive data in the organization. The cloud of gaseous ash and effluence is the toxicity that happens as a result of the data breach. And that toxicity impacts the brand and future sales and marketing, but it also impacts the quality of life of the individuals within that company. And I think what's interesting to me is the extraordinary efforts that are called upon to incident responders, the IT department, even procurement department, legal, PR, and all the different apparatuses of a modern day company, and the extraordinary stress that data breach inflicts upon them. And so as we can see in the SolarWinds case, it is pretty clear to see the exact moment that data breach occurred from the perspective of the stock market. Now, the stock market is an interesting beast, and it defies reality in a lot of ways, in that it is not something that I would say the majority of people have an intimate knowledge of. And as you can see that over time, SolarWinds has slowly recovered some of the value of the stock. And it may well one day recover up to the 23, 24 US dollars per share value. But what is relatively interesting to me is that anyone that had information, be it the bad guys, be it insiders, could have stood to make a tremendous amount of money having either knowledge of the data breach or being able to be prepared to take a short position on the company when the data breach isn't announced. And one of the things that I'm calling for at the end of this presentation in terms of reform is the idea that when a company has declared a data breach, the value of their shares need to be frozen at the exact moment that they declared the data breach. And any previous trades need to come under automatic scrutiny, because we are now in a situation where data breach is very profitable for one type of investor and very unprofitable, in fact, devastating to another type of investor. And we have this awkward relationship, if you will, with the stock market and data breach. So this happened to me. I was invited to brief the United States Congress, House of Representatives on oversight and reform. And this happened as a result of my intimate knowledge of the state of cybersecurity SolarWinds in 2017. At the time when I joined SolarWinds, I came from a relatively small startup, a startup that was intimately familiar with the plight of the mid-market and managed service provider audience that we provided a product to. They were victimized by Russian cyber criminals emulating the types of attacks that were seen in 2015 and 2016 with the idea of infiltrating managed service providers network and using the managed service providers infrastructure to conduct espionage operations. They were known as APT Cloud Hopper. The news broke at Kaspersky's SAS conference in 2015, I believe it was. And we knew right away that there was an existential threat to organizations that either had poor cybersecurity, either as a cultural problem or as a product problem, and frequently as both. And this, I think, would be one of the strongest takeaways from my presentation, is you need to have both sides of the coin in order to be successful in cybersecurity as an organization. That is a culture of security and a secure product. And you need to have the mechanisms in place to ensure that both of those are occurring and both of those are aligned. And so my presentation wasn't a technical presentation. It wasn't about, oh, we don't have up-to-date antivirus, so we're not patching our boxes. My presentation was about creating culture and creating an atmosphere where security was a common business as usual activity and striving to make a product as secure as possible. It was actually, in a lot of ways and in retrospective, a complete understanding of the fact that we were starting from a green field, that there was nothing. And so in order to start building the internal support that you need for security, one has to build the desire and show the business value of security in an organization without a stark demonstration of those failings, as recently seen by Kaseya. So there are a lot of things that happen in a post-data breach scenario, especially when we look at the supply chain, which interestingly enough is not a new occurrence. The supply chain has come under attack on numerous occasions. Kaspersky has done an awful lot of research into ShadowPad, and which culminated in widely publicized attacks on CC Cleaner, where over several 100,000 people that used CC Cleaner, it was an application to clean up the Windows registry, downloaded that tool only to find that malware was indeed packed into it. What we're seeing in the post-data breach world, which has alarmed the legal profession and procurement specialists a lot, is an increasingly concern around post-breach and third-party breach litigation. And so what we see in this case is a note that suggests that up to $90 million in incident response and forensic services for clients that had the SolarWinds Orion product installed would be impacting the various insurance claims that those organizations had for business interruption insurance. And then through a mechanism called subrogation, that enables an insurance company to seek compensation for the harm inflicted, for what they had to pay out. So interestingly enough, this is now generated and culminated into another line item expense as part of the SolarWinds data breach. And then finally, we get to a class action lawsuit, a consolidated class action lawsuit that really talks about the endemic cybersecurity failures, backed up by additional witness testimony from 10 other witnesses, including myself. So I'll leave these links for you to explore. But even within my own realm and understanding and some of the briefing that I did, it would appear that cybersecurity was a very under-resourced, to say the least, commodity at SolarWinds at the time in question, and up to, and in fact leading to, the data breach itself. Which leaves us to the Sad Panda moment. Because with the forecasts that I've seen by some folks on Wall Street indicating a 70% downturn in sales over the next 2 years and a toxic brand in the industry, and some folks vowing that they will never allow a SolarWinds product into their organization ever again, it paints a very bleak picture. But the picture that it paints that's bleak is not really for the high-flying executives and the board members of the company. The picture that it paints that's bleak is for the employees, the marketing people, the analysts people, the software development people, because more and more it becomes a difficult issue to go forward when the brand is so badly perceived in the industry. So the first thing that one needs to do in terms of cybersecurity leadership is achieve personal and professional security competence. It's not really about being an expert in a domain. And in fact, I would argue that being an expert in one particular domain of cybersecurity may exclude a general knowledge of other domain cybersecurity. Unfortunately, we promote within our organization, we tend to promote people that have become expert in one particular domain and then magically expect that they're going to have leadership, communication, and management capabilities without making any investment whatsoever. Quite frankly, in our industry, there are some subject matter experts that should never, ever be customer facing or executive facing. They should always be, I would say, valued employees that have an internal role within IT, within development, and within IT security. Because at the end of the day, you don't have to know everything. But what you have to know is who you can go to know the important information that you know. We're channeling a little bit of my Dick Cheney there. So cybersecurity today has become, in essence, a train wreck, and it's very complicated. It's actually become overly complicated by two trends that happened in 2015. So the first, of course, was CryptoLocker and the rise of ransomware that we're all familiar with. The other trend that you may think hasn't impacted as much has been digital transformation to cloud platforms. Now, one of the big problems that we faced in 2015 forward was software that was sold by vendors was generally, it was up to the software, it was up to the customer to protect the on-premise servers that ran that particular piece of software, okay? And in fact, the vendors essentially, moved all liability for security onto the customer's on-premise infrastructure. And this was fairly, I would say, appropriate for the time, because in general, security should have been risk approach driven. And so, a customer with a high risk would have assumedly have adequate security controls to deal with that risk. And subsequently, if an organization had a lower risk, then they would have a security appropriate to their risk, and the vendor would place their software in that environment, and there would be no further problems. But the movement through digital transformation to cloud caused two problems. The first was vendors all of a sudden realized that in order to be part of this digital transformation and make oodles and oodles of money, they would have to cloud enable their on-premise solutions to be able to monitor things in the cloud, not realizing that they are now exposing something that was, shall we say, protected within that customer's environment using that customer's security controls to the potentially the full onslaught of the internet and its capabilities of attack. So this was where it all fell apart, is where we took kind of, I would say, solutions that were appropriate for an on-premise network, and we decided to bastardize them into something that could monitor our cloud infrastructure, not realizing the level of risk that that might entail with software that was many, many years outdated, and in fact had to support some legacy technologies, which we all know are nearly impossible to secure with the fullness of hindsight now. So my major contention for this presentation on leadership is really around understanding the intersection of the people, the process, and technology of security, and that security leadership needs to be front and center in the organization. Because if, like tectonic plates, the people, the process, and the technology drift apart from each other, you will find the leadership is isolated and alone, and the threat actors can now have a place to inhabit. So the most important part of this is to understand that your role is not simply driving the organization to adopt security around people, process, and technology, but it's actually to align all three and have them rowing in the same direction in your organization and not running into conflict and having silos appear in your organization where the threat actors can inhabit. So the next part of this is really around your personal and professional security improvement, right? You need to learn how to measure cybersecurity. And a lot of folks, I just was in another presentation was talking about cost per record being a terrible metric to kind of measure, a data breach. And I wrote a paper about it along with Davey Winder, and we said it's a terrible idea. But the point of this is this is about trying to understand how to move the benchmarks in your organization without disruptive behavior or being too alarmist at the situation. And so what I like to tell people is that you can do a pen test in your organization, and then you should try to improve, the criticals or the things marked in red, and gear your expenses and build your resiliency around those things that are the critical issues. The next year, have another pen test And hopefully you can show that you've improved in some of the critical areas. This is absolutely important to justify the tremendous amount of money, resources, and time that you're going to spend on trying to move the goalposts forward in your organization. And I always like to say it's way more relevant to have an unbiased opinion of your cybersecurity posture than one that you come up with yourself. It will always fall under scrutiny. There will always be skeptics in the audience. So I tend to look at my benchmark measurements as being something provided to me by outside opinion, so that then we can get a firm grip on the direction of travel along with the industry's trends and some of the common problems that we might see along our industry vertical. So, you know, as an example from learning from mistakes, and I also like to, you know, use this as an example to dispute the most costly cyber attack metaphor that we've talked about. In 2013, the Associated Press Twitter feed got attacked by the Syrian Electronic Army. And as a result of that attack, $136 billion in the equity market disappeared, okay? Now, it did come back. But imagine the amount of money that you could make if you knew that all of a sudden the $136 billion was going to disappear from the market, okay? So this is an example of how we have created a very vulnerable infrastructure where we can do a tremendous amount of damage with disinformation, and a cyber attack on the Associated Press's Twitter account created this. And the cyber attack was essentially a claim that there had been a bomb or an aircraft crash into the White House and that President Obama was injured. So unbelievable impact from just a tweet, right? Accept personal responsibility for security. So I want to make it very clear to you that personal responsibility doesn't necessarily mean you're to blame, okay? You need to drive a big wedge between responsibility and blame. And in fact, victimizing companies and individuals, you know, attempting to blame an intern for security failings is the absolute antithesis to accepting personal responsibility for cybersecurity. In some cases, some people need to accept that and resign from their positions and move on. That's generally a personal choice, and it's generally something that one would consider in the best interests of the company at that particular point, of the shareholders, and of the company management and board. But in general, we need to lead by example, and we need to understand that security in organizations is actually everyone's responsibility. You might have the title, but at the end of the day, you can't control everybody's actions. You can't control the third-party supply chain, and you can't control acts of God or what have you. There will be times when accepting responsibility will be difficult. But if you have a good team and you know everyone's done a good, made their best effort, you have nothing to fear, okay? And that, I think, is one of the big takeaways, is that doing security and failing is acceptable, but lying that you had security and then failing now is the worst possible scenario that you could find yourself in, right? So accept personal responsibility for security. It will go a long way in changing your dynamic from trying to win against cyber criminals to just trying to not lose against cyber criminals. It changes your philosophical relationship with it. So the other thing that you need to understand is that disasters can happen to companies, and that one of the problems that we're faced with right now in cybercrime, and one of the things that I call for a solution, is vendor accountability. We are in this really difficult place right now where a lot of the infrastructure that we use to conduct e-commerce, to do our business, to provide value, is also being used by the cyber criminals to attack us. So there is certainly a need for service providers to provide know thy customer, very similar to banking information. And just to underscore my point, when this OVH data center caught on fire, one of Kaspersky's researchers, Konstantin Rilu, he tweeted out that they saw about a 30% reduction in the command and control servers responsible for APT and cyber criminal groups as a result of that fire. So interestingly enough, that leads us to the belief that the culpability of cybercrime is also found in the aiding and abetting of various infrastructure providers. So something to think about in terms of how we look at the problem of cybersecurity. And you know, it comes to a point where the security of your organization is so lacking that it then becomes a potential opportunity for meme culture to take over. But I think it's important to understand that part of that personal responsibility mantra is understanding that one of the reasons why CEOs, CFOs, CIOs, CISOs, maybe not in my case, are paid an extraordinary amount of money because the expectation of them is to lead and not put a far junior member under the team under the bus. So I want to kind of now shift focus a little bit to understand why disclosure of a cyber attack is so vitally important. And I really feel that we're at a point now where we need mandatory data breach. In the United Kingdom and EU, we're getting closer to that with the mandatory reporting of a data breach involving sensitive data. But I think we have to move one step further and ask for mandatory data breach reporting, even if it's intellectual property that has been stolen from the organization. Because if that intellectual property is of significant value to the military industrial complex, to research and development, et cetera, we now find ourselves in a situation where we suffered a tremendous economic loss and no one can benefit from the disclosure of what actually occurred. So in this particular scenario, the Colonial Pipeline allowed everyone to understand what happened, where their failings were. They said that it was a VPN machine, a VPN service. It was neglected. There was it wasn't used by employees anymore, but yet there was an opportunity to use valid credentials to it, was not protected by multi-factor authentication, and that's how they got ransomware. But let's face it, the ransomware that Colonial Pipeline got hit with targeted the billing system. And the narrative they lost control of. As a result of the narrative, we had Americans loading gasoline into plastic bags and the back of their pickup trucks because of the perception that there was a gas shortage coming. The system that got actually attacked was the billing system. And I think it's fair to say, some may differ in our community, and I've had some debates on this, but I think it's fair to say that if the bad guys have gotten access to the billing system, it's potentially possible for them to move into the operational technology or the flow system. So what my opinion was for Colonial Pipeline is they should have done two things. The first is they should have said and gone with the abundance of caution by shutting the system down to ensure that there isn't a giant environmental disaster, i.e. an Exxon Valdez incident, or a Gulf BP oil spill incident that resulted in a giant fireball and the loss of life. I think that'd be a much more positive way to spin the events that happened. The other thing that they needed to point out is that this was a temporary problem because there is something that the United States has that a lot of people don't know about called the National Petroleum Reserve. They have an entirely different system run by the Army Corps of Engineers of the United States that could supply fuel oil to all sorts of other refineries to deal with any sort of long-term shortages. So the fact of the matter was, this was an example of an excellent post-game analysis of how the organization failed. But in terms of improvement tips, I would suggest that we need to steer away a little bit from the hysteria and keep it more in the realm of the realistic. So, being able to see this unfold again at another company was very interesting to me, where the quotations are really around a lack of cybersecurity investment, a desire of the organization to save money, and that led to impactful attacks against other organizations. At some point, you can expect, at least in the US system, them to take action. They already did in the case of the Colonial Pipeline and provided some excellent guidance. I think they needed to go a lot more forward with that and put in a legislative agenda tied to their national critical infrastructure initiatives that they have underway now. So a lot of folks have talked about this in the last little while, and it's even occasionally bubbled up on the UK radar about the cyber war drums, that we're in cyber war. I want to assure everyone that I really don't think cyber war is going to take place. The reason being is the countries that would benefit the most from a cyber war are the ones that would be attacking us. And although they would inflict significant damage to us, in some cases, the result would be catastrophic for those countries. But I think more to the point, we have a lot more to lose from antagonizing those malicious actors than we do by building better defenses. And this is where you have to take your mindset and kind of tweak it a little bit. And when you realize that you can wipe out $153 billion from the equity stock market by compromising somebody's Twitter account, then it puts us in a very precarious digital war scenario where all of that infrastructure could easily come under attack. And it has. In 2015, the Iranians did mass denial of service attacks against the US banks, and the American response was not to bomb Iran. It was to assist the American banks in strengthening their defenses against these types of attack. So obviously the narrative continues. It is a good narrative, and it is a narrative, in my opinion, that prevents a major catastrophe, because the attack surface is no longer just the financial or stock trading service. The attack surface is hospitals, national critical infrastructure, railways, and transport. So let's be realistic about this. Nobody wants to see planes falling out of the sky. So on that sort of note, let's transfer a little bit more into the principles of leadership and talk about setting a personal example of being secure. This is where you need to practice what you preach. So in the UK, we benefit quite a bit from secure customer authentication, which was something a lot of people didn't know about. And boy, was I surprised when PayPal started asking me to enable multi-factor authentication, which you're absolutely right, I should have had enabled in the first place. But my point being is I didn't use it very often. So I felt, no, I'm not making an excuse. I'm just going to say I was a bit surprised. So I looked into it. Apparently, it became a law. And that was really interesting to me that, basically by the 14th of September, UK retailers will be required to abide by robust two-factor authentication requirement. Wow, who knew? But interestingly enough, apparently Microsoft did when they put forward a stat from just a little while ago that said about 99% of these attacks could be blocked by multi-factor authentication. So, in the UK, we're actually no strangers to this, because most of the major banks that I deal with are already requiring multi-factor authentication and 3 random digits from your password, which forces me to write down my password and write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 over it, because I can't do that math in my head to get access to my account. But I mean, we're doing particularly well here in comparison to the United States and in Canada, where my credit union just made a huge investment in upgrading their online web portal and are still asking me security questions. Like, can we please just move? Like 2006 called and they'd like their security questions back. Let's just move to multi-factor authentication already. Now, as CISOs, as leaders, as people that are going to move into organizations, ensure everyone knows the meaning and intent of the security program. Okay, this is the one. Number 5, I think, is probably the one that will resonate the most, because you need to explain why to people. And I just break it down into basically 4 questions that every employee, every staff member should be able to understand how we do it. Not at the technical level, but at the broad level of the organization. How does the organization receive money, right? How does the organization send money? What's the unique value propositions, and how are those unique value propositions safeguarded? Why do customers buy from us? Right? Because that's the things that you need to align the security program to. This is why you need to tell people that updates on the Wednesdays of the second week are when we do updates. And the reason we need to do those updates is many of you use these systems that are critical to business operations, right? Explain it to them, make them understand, and by all means, drag in information that is out there about impactful cyber attacks that have happened in your vertical industry to your partners and neighbors when you can, just to make it resonant. The other thing to understand too as a cybersecurity leader is communication skills. Now, I'm guilty of using a lot of military metaphors because I'm ex-military in my presentations. But what I will say is one of the things that the military does teach is clarity and conciseness of your communications. Most people come into this industry of cybersecurity without the benefit of a background in using analyst speak as opposed to using either journalistic or academic speak. And what I find in a lot of organizations is if the team or the cybersecurity people start moving in the direction of long emails or PowerPoint decks filled with text, then it's going to lose its impact on the non-technical audience that can't understand the languages and the nuance and the jargon that we use in this profession. So what I would say is use the framework of the so and so what. So as in this happened, so what as in what does it mean to our organization. And the other thing I would say is that 400,000 years ago, we were drawing pictures on caves, inside caves. And to this very day, you can see what those pictures are about, right? A guy with a spear throwing it at an animal. They're hunters, right? What I'm saying is 400,000 years later, if we've now resorted to text, where our message is lost in the nuance of language, draw a picture, use it to lead your people through the current state to the preferred state, or the problem to the solution. Draw a picture and you'll be able to communicate across department a lot more effectively than you can by using text. Embrace security improvement opportunities. You can always do something, okay? That needs to be the mantra going forward. And again, if you don't know it exists, how can you secure it? You need to get into the organization in procurement, in project management, in digital transformation, in audit, in the council's office. You need to know what's going on. Because if you don't know what's going on, new technology will suddenly arrive. You will be responsible for the cybersecurity of it, but you will not even know it exists until you find it. And I hope and pray that you find it under pleasurable circumstances. So again, we lead ourselves now to the SolarWinds story a bit. And they said that they wanted to spend a bunch of money on cybersecurity. Let me go back. I just kind of screwed it up, which is great, but it's expensive to do it. And it's really expensive to do it after an impactful data breach. These are some of the forecasts that are coming out, that earnings are forecast to decline by an average of 77% per year for the next 3 years, that the interest that their payments are not well covered by the earnings. Because when SolarWinds went from being a private company to a public company, they did it by financing themselves through a debt offering. So the company, even though it is valued at a $4.5 billion company, is carrying approximately $2 billion of debt. So one of the things that hasn't been talked about a lot that I want to really underscore here, and this is my opinion on this, is we know that the SolarWinds Orion breach managed to get into the United States courts system, which is called PACER, Public Access to Court Electronic Records. This is where I get a lot of cybercrime indictments that I can read through for the tactics, the tools and procedures that the bad guys use in terms of their various cyber scams. But one of the things that concerns me greatly is that PACER also has sensitive information about cases that are pending, or that have gone to, in their judicial system, something called a grand jury, or indictments that are currently sealed because they contain confidential information. We know that the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security email box was compromised. What we don't know is if the bad guys were able to do a password reset via email on PACER and give that extraordinary level of access that I believe that an individual that would be the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security would have. So it's highly likely that very confidential, sensitive information around potentially counterterrorism, counter-espionage could have been revealed to the Russian APT actors that came through that particular corridor. And we could see this supply chain attack resulted in an email inbox compromise, which resulted in privileged access to a potentially to a system that has potentially sensitive information in it. I've benefited a lot from taking a cyber threat intelligence approach to dealing with attempted attacks on organization. And I share here from my time at AmTrust when we detected an attack based on some typo squatting domains that were created, we're able to intercept it. I believe this type of communication is important to demonstrate value of a cybersecurity program in your organization, where you can tell them the story about how you managed to defeat an attack before it actually occurred. And to assist you on that journey, I would recommend the website Decent Security, web and phishing investigation. It also has links available to report any attempted attacks on your organization as well. And of course, in the UK, we benefit a lot from the work and effort of the National Cybersecurity Center. They have a CNR service now. It has been renamed Early Warning. Highly recommended. It's based on the shadow server network of essentially a bunch of honeypots out there on the internet waiting to be attacked, and then providing that data to companies that may have vulnerabilities that appear to be being attacked by cyber criminals. So really excellent support here in the UK. The other thing that I want to talk about now is making sound and timely security decisions. It's incredibly important that we pivot and we make decisions based on the information that we have, and that those decisions are recorded. Because at the end of the day, we can't be making this stuff up. We need to understand the situation as it is at that particular moment so that we can get the necessary resources deployed in order to mitigate the threat or even contain the threat. And again, this is out of scope for this particular lecture, but I do talk about a lot the intelligence cycle of how you incorporate cyber threat intelligence into a decision-making process. So one of the things that you can take away that's really easy, and I think is very applicable to cybersecurity, is to run your ideas through two of the razors, right? Never attribute it to malice, which is adequately explained by stupidity or an innocent mistake. And Occam's razor, of course, there exists two explanations for an occurrence. The more assumptions you have to make, the more unlikely the explanation is. Always apply these two things to an organization, because it's true that you can be secure, you can be breached, and you can be compliant all at the very same time. Little quantum physics applied to cybersecurity. And never ignore a security incident. Inform your supervisor and/or security operations. Again, this only works if you've removed the blame culture from your organization and that everyone is committed to improvement, right? As an example, do the exact opposite of what the post office did with the Horizon system, right? Don't try and remove the evidence of a security problem to claim that a security problem never existed to begin with. Essentially, the idea of a security incident is to learn from organizational breakdowns in either the people or the process or the technology, right? And I think it's incredibly important to even take a reward system for this type of thing for people that do take the time out to report something suspicious, because at some point they may anticipate or identify an attack that's in the early stages of forming. So one of the things that I talked about earlier on is about being personally responsible. This is the criminal complaint against Joseph Sullivan, who, as you may know, was the CIO of Uber. And he essentially covered up the fact that they had a data breach. He attempted to pay the hackers using bug bounty funds to pretend that the data breach never happened. He was caught. He has been charged with obstruction of justice, and something very interesting that you don't see a lot in cybersecurity, misprision of a felony, which is essentially knowing about a crime, but failing to report that crime. So again, what I'm saying is hold yourself to a high standard, ensure that security incidents are properly documented and handled, and what your decisions were during that whole particular time, or you may end up on the wrong side of one of these. And also, I included in the notes a little bit, again, by security incidences, that the fact that a company ended up having to pay 2 ransoms to the same attacker because they didn't fix the cybersecurity problem that that allowed the attacker access to their systems the first time. It's a very interesting story. It's got a tragic element to it because it's believed that it was a youth at the time that conducted these attacks, and now since a MLAT treaty was signed between Cyprus and the United States, he, at the ripe old age of 21, has been extradited to the United States for crimes that he committed when he was a minor. So truly a cautionary and frightening tale. So again, to underscore as we move into the final part of this, and we talk a little bit about the solution stack, cybersecurity leadership is about what you don't know, who you know that might know, and how you grow from each security success or failure. So a lot of people ask me, and say, Ian, you're sort of like a bit of Cassandra in that you know the future, and a lot of people don't listen to you. I want to walk you through now where I see where we need to go in order to fix what we have. So the first is security architecture review. What we've built over the past 25, 30 years, which is still in service today, is not fit for purpose. We need to work on attack surface exposure monitoring, segmentation, encryption at rest and encryption in transit. And if you can't do that, for God's sakes, wrap your data in some sort of encrypted tunnels like IPsec. We need to geofence access. This is becoming a lot more important when we have proof of concepts for zero-day attacks dropped on Twitter, which 24 to 48 hours are in the hands of cyber criminals, and 24 hours later are being used to attack organizations as low-hanging fruit. We need to look at both using security groups and access control lists appropriately, because what happens is we forget about stuff. Vulnerable services are left, and even though those services are protected by security groups, they're accessible to the entire internet and can be exploited. We need logging, a lot more logging, to do post-forensics work as well, and to detect anomalous behavior. I say that governance and risk, project management office, procurement, legal, HR engagement, third-party attestation, and pen tests all are part of the new paradigm, if you will. And all, yes, will be expensive if they're left to their own devices. But if you have a project management office, create a security awareness training for project management or for procurement, and lead them through why it's important that they do a little bit of due diligence and background on vendors. Try to get into the meetings with the vendors and ask them some basic hygiene questions. DevSecOps. This is where DevSecOps will start being folded into what I see as active threat hunting and being responsible for IR and being responsible for BCP DR. I feel that cyber threat intelligence programs will feed into DevSecOps. This is incredibly important for them to establish detective controls based on MITRE ATT&CK framework, establish a bug bounty program, start using things like SonarQube and quality assurance sanity checks using, even open source scanners like Zap. I built an entire secure software development lifecycle using a QA department and arming them with SQL map and Zap to at least make sure no critical or high known vulnerabilities got into production. Vulnerability management, Windows application firewalls on demand. If you can't get to fix it right away, like a new Apache Struts vulnerability that comes out, and you look like you're going to have to rewrite a whole bunch of code in order to apply the patch because it failed in test, then deploy a Windows application firewall in front of it temporarily before, so you're not running your people ragged trying to update, an app on the fly in production. That never works out well. Monitoring of the third-party supply chain health, when, a trusted customer or trusted supplier declares a data breach, figure out what your risk is. What is your attack surface in that? Threat hunting and IR capability I already mentioned. Way more due diligence needs to be applied in the whole procurement. One of the people asked me, Ian, how can you fix the supply chain problem? It comes down to really outside operational IT security. It needs to be part of the information management program. It needs to really permeate your procurement and your project management offices and legal in order to ask the reasonable questions. So I'm not even asking the tough questions, but the reasonable questions around things like risk and the plan that the vendor has and what their best practices are. Like if you get a document in this day and age that says you need to put all of these whitelist exceptions in and you need to poke holes in your firewall to make it Swiss cheese, that might not be an acceptable security solution if you're handling private data or intellectual property, so consider that quite a bit. And again, we'll just leave on that note. You're building a network, people that know people. Get on Twitter, get on LinkedIn. We'll see you at conferences when we can get back in front of each other. And yeah, I guess, I'll leave it on this slide and we can wrap it up now. But, this is just some of my thoughts around where we need to go at a very high level in terms of fixing the cybersecurity issues that we're faced with today. So thank you very much, Oxford University, and all the other attendees today from all the other institutions. Really my pleasure to present to you today.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. That was fascinating. Yeah, it's fantastic. We've got a couple of questions, I think. Roy in the question in the chat is asking a couple of questions. Perhaps we can answer those. I know we're slightly short on time. So Roy asks, most people would agree with your advice. What is it that prevents them from actually taking your advice?
I think it's that when you contextualize the reasons for cybersecurity, we have to draw in a couple of parallels. The first is it needs to sort of be adopted in our work life, in our travel life, and at home. And we need to draw those parallels across the organization. And then when it's job specific, so when you're talking to the procurement people, you can lead them down the path of, let's talk about things like ISO 27001 and what an ISO 27001 certificate really means when you're dealing with an organization. I know it appears like a checkmark box to you, but this is why it's important. This is why you want to ask for some of these documents, like give me the control sheet of your information security policy so I can see when it was last updated, right? And it's little things that you can do like that, and then you can go to Showdown and see if they have any exposed services, and you can do a lot of things to assist them in trying to understand the level of cyber hygiene that organization has. That's just dealing with procurement. And so what I tend to try and do is I've said recently, cybersecurity awareness training generic across the company, it just isn't effective. It's like sending a generic phishing email to the entire company, because the bad guys aren't doing that anymore. They are specifically attacking certain functions and roles within the company. So let's make our cybersecurity awareness training fit for each type of role that we're asking people to do, from help desk right on up to the CEO. And get your CEO to use multi-factor authentication for his work email, right? Because I'm sure as shit certain that he's using it for his banking. So come on, if you're willing to do it for your own personal stuff, please give me a break, do it for work, leadership by example, and make all those other people that report to you do it as well.
Thank you. Then I have a couple of questions a little bit there then. So Roy, a follow-up there is saying, are there any examples of companies that are following your advice that you can tell us, or are you not allowed to?
Every company that's not breached. No. No, like I think what's happened is it's become, there's companies that have suffered and then they've made like massive improvements, right? And they're going through this. And SolarWinds and Kaseya are examples of companies that suffered massively and are going through improvements. But Maersk is probably the one that has in conversations that I've seen their former CIO and CISO give, and in some private conversations that I had which were people close to their response to the NotPetya cyber attack, they have completely rebuilt their culture, and they've completely rebuilt their infrastructure and made it a lot more resilient. And it's the lessons learned from that were so vitally important. Like the only way Maersk could put their entire Active Directory infrastructure back together is they had one server in Africa that, because of a saturated internet link, didn't get encrypted. So that server, located in Africa on a saturated link, became the most important server ever in the history of that company, because with that server, once they had gotten rid of the ransomware, they could rebuild their entire Active Directory, users, policies, access control lists, etc. Right? So this became, an example where, hey, let's spool up an Active Directory server, let it replicate, over the weekend, and then turn it off and have it, for the full week, and then replicate it again, so that we always have that backup. It's little things like that. And this is why, dialing into sort of cyber threat intelligence, but paying attention to the stories out there and trying to get at some of the technical tidbits is critical for us.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's fascinating. Can I ask a bit of a trivial question?
Of course.
why hasn't the US and why isn't Canada doing two-factor authentication? If the CEO is doing it for his bank or her bank, then why aren't countries picking up on these fairly standard things?
So one of the problems is, I would say that I'll go back and say, information security is politicized in the United States because information security, the large part of it, except for specific federal institutions or federal regulated institutions, is left to the states to decide. Okay, and there are some profit-oriented, medium, small, large businesses that don't want to that want to do the bare minimum investment, right? For, obviously commercial reasons. That I think is changing. I think the reality is that this is an essential step to business. With the Kaseya attacks, I was dealing with MSPs that had 250 servers across 30 customers simultaneously ransomware. There's your business that you've been building for 25 years wiped out overnight, right? So I think they're understanding it. I think their adoption is slow because the American financial system is actually made up of these tiny islands of independent banks and credit unions spread throughout the United States. If a company if all of the 4 major banks in the United States mandated that any banking partner of theirs, anybody that wanted to do business, or the federal treasury of the United States said, anybody handling X amount of dollars per week or per month or per year has to adopt this technology. If they could get that through the regulatory hurdles and the Congress and the Republican Congress filibusters, they could make progress. But we're much better off, I think, in a lot of ways in the United Kingdom because, we do have the FCA who can make impactful changes on, the conduct of our banking infrastructure. And, basically what they say goes. There's no argument. It doesn't get politicized because it's a regulated thing.
Yeah, that's politics then. It all boils down to politics. Yeah. Well, maybe we should look to draw a line under and conclude the session before we get too political.
All right.
But yeah, I think we've covered the questions and things. There's one last point from Budi. With the recent news that Kaseya attackers are evil, are disappearing, do you think the governments and LEAs are fighting back?
I know that the government and LEAs are fighting back 100%. You'll probably see a year from now, maybe a year and a half, you'll see some arrests, you'll see some indictments. These investigations take an awfully long period of time. There are 2 things that the United States is really not afraid of doing. One is extrajudicial territorial action, i.e. arresting you in another country for crimes against the United States or its citizens, or crimes involving US dollars, which is something a lot of people don't quite understand, that if you are using the United States financial system in any way, shape, or form, you are subject to the US laws, interestingly enough. The other thing about this, which is now become very interesting and is a point of contention, is cyber criminals are getting it's increasingly difficult for them to have freedom of movement, because what the United States is now doing in a lot of cases is indicting in absentia, which then places an internet red notice. And when it's added to the FBI's wanted list, there is a large cash incentive provided to countries that scoop these people up and return them. That's something that you don't see in the news stories, but literally, when you're wanted by the United States and your country grabs ya, there's cash. Oh, there's cash money, man. So this now drives the cyber criminals into a back corner. Now, our evil used to be Grand Cab. A lot of the crew that worked in the Grand Cab APT group rebranded into our evil. Our evil, as we like to say in cybercrime, have gone ghost. They will rebrand again for sure. But the point is law enforcement is active. Law enforcement is investigating. I think because of the nature of the attack, there's widespread support from any other nation law enforcement organizations. The other thing that the United States is very good at, which is quite extraordinary, is that the US Constitution, most of the protections apply to US citizens, okay? They don't apply to non-US citizens. So what does this mean exactly? It means the rules around search and seizure that protect you as an American citizen do not apply. So if you've looked at some of the Mueller indictments where they were investigating the Russian tampering, it's pretty interesting to see that many of the pictures of the alleged perpetrators of the Russian FSB look suspiciously like they were taken with the laptop camera that they were standing in front of. And if you read carefully through that Mueller indictment, it appears that every step, every activity that the Russians took was recorded in excruciatingly detail. So what I'm going to say is I think that the FBI and other American agencies are not above going after in a way to get all of the necessary evidence to build a case, because the perpetrators are actually not protected by the US Constitution when it comes to unreasonable search and seizure.
We've got a thanks here as well in the chat. Wow. Well, maybe perhaps on that point, then on that bombshell, we should conclude.
All right.
Thank you so much for giving up your time to come and talk. Yeah, I've certainly enjoyed it, and I hope everyone that's joined has as well.